Welcome to the debate. Usually, when we measure danger on a battlefield, we look for things we can actually quantify, right?
Right. We look for craters. We look for plasma fires.
Exactly. We measure the blast radius of a concussive explosive, and we just point at the destruction and say, well, there it is. That is the threat.
Yeah,
It's tangible.
it is.
But today, we're looking at a weapon that doesn't break bones. It breaks causality itself. But before we get into that, let's do a quick recap of our previous discussion.
We definitely should, because it perfectly sets the stage for how we evaluate power in Gentrics universe.
It really does. So last time, we spent our entire session dissecting the Fuse Master's dynamite staff during that massive sequence in the Shaolin Timber Forest.
Right, and we went back and forth on whether that gunpowder-coated staff was, like, a brilliant paradigm-shifting tactical design.
Or just a fragile gimmick, right? Like something that could be completely neutralized by a simple pouch of water.
Exactly. And where we ultimately landed was looking past the immediate explosions to the overarching logistical impact.
Because the actual physical death of the Fuse Master quietly but permanently cut off Crater Steve's supply line for his heavy kinetic weaponry.
Right. Without even realizing the geopolitical magnitude of what he had done, the protagonist essentially severed the enemy's entire research and development arm.
It was just a massive structural blow to Aeon Pax's terrestrial forces. Crater Steve was suddenly fighting a war of attrition without his primary manufacturer.
It really highlighted how a single localized victory can just unravel an entire continent's supply chain.
Which is actually the perfect lens for our discussion today. We spent all that time last session evaluating the physical output and logistical consequences of a strictly kinetic weapon.
Right.
But what happens when the battlefield manipulation isn't kinetic at all? Today, we're asking a central question about a very different kind of elemental art. Is Zeryl the single most dangerous power in the book?
And we are definitely split on this one.
Oh, absolutely. Because I have to argue that Zeryl possesses what is essentially the weakest power on the page, since it has zero combat viability and it nearly destroys the user.
And I will argue that Zeryl's ability is unequivocally the most dangerous, because it is the sole catalyst for every major tragedy in the narrative, doing catastrophic damage without ever throwing a punch.
Okay, well, let's actually look at the metrics of power across the continent of Kadesh, right? Power in this universe is strictly defined by physical output and the capacity to survive a conflict.
Okay, but
Hang on, just think about it. We see Iolite wielding his corrupted red wind, leveling entire landscapes. We see the concussive force of the Fuse Master's staff.
sure, those are highly visible.
They are credible, lethal threats. By contrast, Zeryl's ability to warp space-time using the void is fascinating from a theoretical physics standpoint, but it is objectively the weakest power shown in the text.
I can't agree with that framing.
It cannot inflict physical harm on an opponent, though. If you put Zeryl in a direct fight, he has absolutely no offensive capabilities. Furthermore, the physical toll of utilizing this spatial anomaly taxes his biology to the absolute breaking point.
Well, it is an extreme burden, yes.
It's an act of sheer desperation that he can only perform once. So when you compare it to the devastating, practical applications of the other elemental arts, Zeryl is a liability on the battlefield. He isn't a credible threat.
Look, I hear your emphasis on physical output, but the definition of dangerous simply does not require immediate lethality.
How so?
You are measuring danger by looking for a smoking crater. I am measuring danger by looking at the timeline of suffering for the protagonist's family. Zeryl's spatial manipulation is the single undeniable cause of every major catastrophic event in the story.
I mean, I guess you could trace it back, but
Think about what actually happens. It is the only reason Xeonix was able to meet his grandfather Xeon Clerics during the Congo War. And because of that impossible meeting, it is the exact reason Iolite ever noticed the novice bloodline existed in the first place.
But is that the power being dangerous or just the circumstance?
When you look at the ripple effects of that single action, nothing else in the book has caused this level of generational devastation. That is what makes it dangerous.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on how we evaluate cause and effect here. We really need to dig into the mechanics of how the void actually works.
Okay, let's get into the mechanics.
You are arguing that simply triggering an event makes the power itself inherently dangerous. But let's look at the strict canon of what Zeryl is doing. He is not some omnipotent deity warping reality on a whim.
Right. No, the elemental arts don't work like that.
Exactly. What he actually does is utilize his specific affinity to create a localized vacuum in the void.
Right. A vacuum that connects two distant points in time.
Yes, but we have to explain how unstable that actually is. In Gentrics' world, the universe isn't just a passive backdrop where things happen. It is a living ecosystem with strict natural laws, and time travel is absolutely forbidden by those laws.
It really is. The universe pushes back.
Violently. It isn't just risky. The universe actively rejects the paradox like an immune system attacking a virus. The atmospheric pressure of normal space-time violently rushes in to crush that vacuum.
Which is why Zeryl struggles so much to hold it open.
Exactly. Zeryl is essentially acting as a biological tent pole, trying to hold up a collapsing tent of space-time, which is why it nearly kills him. This is exactly why Zeryl explicitly warns Xeonix right before the jump.
He says, if you're seen or you change anything, we're in serious trouble.
Right. So think about a broken lock on a heavy iron door. Zeryl is just the broken lock. He provided a temporary opening. But a broken lock is not dangerous in and of itself.
I see where you're going with this.
It's the monster that walks through that door that poses the actual threat. You're blaming the door for what the monster did.
See, I come at it from a different way. It's less like a broken lock and more like introducing a microfracture to a massive hydroelectric dam.
Okay, a dam.
Yeah, Zeryl didn't cause the flood himself, but he fundamentally compromised the structural integrity of the timeline to let the water through. And that microfracture is precisely what makes his ability a weapon of mass disruption.
But he doesn't use it as a weapon.
Because, as you just perfectly articulated, time travel is forbidden by the natural laws of the universe. When you break those fundamental laws, you don't just quietly slip through a door. You create massive, violent shockwaves.
But let's be very clear about the text here. Zeryl didn't even travel through the rift. Only Xeonix travels through time in this universe. Nobody else. Ever.
Exactly!
Zeryl just stayed behind and held the fracture open.
He stayed behind because the physical toll was so immense he couldn't survive the journey. But even though only Xeonix physically traveled through time, the sheer atmospheric pressure of that paradox collapsing is what allowed the timeline's greatest tragedy to take root. Think about that moment on the battlefield of the Congo War. Why did Iolite look over? Because the atmospheric pressure of the universe trying to crush that localized vacuum created an undeniable spectacle.
The visual disturbance, yeah.
Right, that localized vacuum breaking the rules of nature is what drew everyone's attention. If Zeryl never bends the void, that paradox never happens. The universe remains intact. The danger isn't in a blast radius, it's in the structural compromise of reality itself.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently.
Okay.
You are placing the blame for the resulting tragedy entirely on the shockwave of Zeryl's spatial anomaly. But that completely strips away the terrifying human agency of the actual villains.
I'm not stripping away their agency.
Let's look at exactly what happened after that shockwave on the battlefield. Xeonix drops into the past. He fights alongside his grandfather Xeon Clerics. Iolite sees them fighting across the smoke.
Right.
Now, we must be absolutely clear on the canon facts here, because this is where a lot of readers get confused. Iolite never learned the future. He did not witness some magical prophecy of his own defeat.
No, he deduced it.
Precisely. Iolite deduced the survival of the bloodline purely from observing Xeonix's face and recognizing the highly specific green wind fighting style being used on the battlefield.
He's incredibly observant.
He put the pieces together through sheer paranoid intellect. And what was his response? He didn't use the elemental arts to counter it. He didn't build a time machine. He planted Malamar in the past, years in advance, living in Sukar.
As Kenshin.
Right. Malamar aged forward normally, day by day, year by year, waiting patiently to infiltrate the boy's life. I argue that the true danger in this story lies in Iolite's chillingly patient paranoia and Malamar's methodical, decades-long grooming process.
It is horrific, I agree.
Malamar spent 20 years assuming the identity of Kenshin, lying to a child every single day. Blaming Zeryl's one-time spatial anomaly gives Iolite a pass for orchestrating one of the most insidious psychological tortures in the narrative.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. I am not giving Iolite a pass for his cruelty.
It kind of sounds like it, though.
No, the psychological torture that Malamar inflicts as Kenshin is horrific. But human agency in Gentrics' universe is almost always reacting to elemental catalysts.
Reacting, sure, but the choice is theirs.
You say Iolite's paranoia is the true danger, but what triggered the paranoia? Without Zeryl bending the void to force that impossible battlefield meeting, Iolite never looks across the smoke and makes that deduction.
Okay, yes, the initial spark.
He never sees the green wind style being wielded by a boy who looks exactly like his brother, which means Malamar is never assigned to infiltrate Xeonix's life in Sukar in the first place.
But the execution of that infiltration was entirely human malice. Zeryl didn't force Malamar to manipulate a child for 20 years. The Void didn't dictate Kenshin's betrayals.
No, but
That was a choice made by a highly intelligent, deeply compromised individual operating on orders from an even more paranoid commander. Zeryl's power was just the flash in the pan. The 20-year burn was all human.
it is human malice ignited by a void mechanic, though. You cannot separate the two. Look, if the elemental arts of Orion and Pikudoish are a massive powder keg, Zeryl's space-time fold was the spark.
But again, spark versus the explosion itself.
Zeryl's power is dangerous precisely because it operates entirely outside the predictable kinetic warfare of Eon packs. It bypasses terrestrial armies and strikes directly at causality.
It's unconventional, I'll give you that.
It doesn't matter that Zeryl couldn't throw a punch. He changed the board so radically that the enemy had to resort to a 20-year psychological operation just to counter his one move.
I'm not totally convinced by that line of reasoning, because you're treating the catalyst as if it possesses the intent of the resulting explosion.
How so?
It's like blaming the person who discovered fire for every arsonist in history. Zeryl's intent was survival. It was a desperate gambit to save Xeonix. He wasn't orchestrating a generational war.
But intent doesn't dictate danger, right? A runaway train doesn't have malice, but it's still incredibly dangerous.
That is true.
Zeryl's manipulation of the void unleashed forces he couldn't control, and the fallout was catastrophic.
Well, that's a fair distinction between intent and outcome. And honestly, while I maintain that Zeryl is mechanistically the weakest combatant on the board, I have to concede a massive point to you regarding the structural impact of his ability.
All right, I'm listening.
From a purely narrative perspective, looking at the entire scope of the book, I cannot deny that the trauma unleashed because of that closed causal loop is infinitely worse than anything Eon Pax does with their terrestrial armies.
It really is. The systemic damage is staggering.
It is. When we step back and look at the sheer scale of the suffering, the fact that Malamar raised Xeonix with the deliberate, conscious intention of breaking his spirit from the inside out, that is profound. It far exceeds the localized kinetic damage of a plasma fire.
Absolutely.
By creating that localized vacuum in the void, Zeryl inadvertently facilitated unparalleled psychological and systemic damage to the protagonist's lineage. So structurally and narratively, the damage is unprecedented. I will concede that.
That is a deeply fair point, and it really gets to the heart of how Gentrics uses the elemental arts to explore psychological trauma. And look, to be equally fair to your initial premise, I have to concede the strict physical parameters of Zeryl ability.
The complete lack of combat viability.
Exactly. On a purely mechanical and physical level, Zeryl's power is useless in an actual skirmish.
Right, it's just not practical.
The physical toll of acting as that biological tentpole is so debilitating that it renders him completely vulnerable. If Zeryl were to step into an arena against Crater Steve or any master of the Whistling Wind style, he is dead in 3 seconds.
Instantly defeated.
Right. It requires too much time, demands too much concentration, and exacts way too heavy a biological price. So you are absolutely correct. It is not a combat viable art.
It is a fascinating dichotomy, isn't it? And it really brings us to the core of what makes the elemental arts in this universe so compelling to analyze.
It really does.
We've spent this entire discussion circling how danger is actually measured. I have maintained that danger is best evaluated by immediate kinetic destruction. And under those metrics, creating a localized vacuum in the void is an extreme liability.
Right. It breaks the user long before it breaks the enemy. And I have maintained that true danger should be measured by the terrifying ripple effects of defying the universe's natural laws.
Which it certainly did.
Right. I think what we can completely agree on is the underlying brilliance of how the Void is written. By making the universe actively reject time travel, the text prevents the Void from becoming a cheap escape hatch.
Absolutely. The intricate mechanics of this universe leave plenty of room for our listeners to form their own interpretation of what constitutes the greatest threat.
Exactly. Is it the corrupted red wind you can see burning towards you, or the space-time anomaly you can't even touch? We will leave that for you to decide.
But the fallout of that Congo War battlefield meeting leaves us with some incredibly heavy character dynamics to unpack in our next session.
Because the man Xeon went back to see is arguably the most complicated figure in the lore.
He certainly is. Join us for our next discussion, where we'll be asking the question, Xeon Clerics, hero or cautionary tale?
It's going to require us to question every piece of conventional wisdom we've gathered about the novice bloodline so far.
Until then, think back to our earlier premise. When you are navigating the intricate, elemental world of Pegadesh, you have to remember that not every threat leaves a smoking crater in the ground.
Sometimes the most devastating weapon isn't the one that breaks your bones.
Exactly. It's the one that quietly breaks causality and lets the monsters walk right through the front door.